right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I just want to say a special thank you to Reagan, Stephanie, and Joseph who are joining us to talk today. Reagan is the pastor of House for All Sinners and Saints here in Denver, and Stephanie Kopsch is the interim director of Holy Comforter. Well, not anymore, right?
Not anymore, no.
But
I'm in conversation with another congregation.
Yeah, and you've been serving ELCA, Episcopal, and you went to Presbyterian Seminary, so a wealth of knowledge there. And we also have Joseph Waliniak, the Associate Rector of Christ Church, Denver. And I see a few other clergy on here too, so this is going to be some great discussion. We've heard from some church administrators that there is no training for when they join a church as an administrator, and maybe they're tasked with putting together the church bulletin, and there's just a lot of information that they don't know. I mean, you don't know what you don't know. Personal story, I was hired from the non-denominational church world to St. John's Cathedral in Denver, and it was my first week, and I had to pull the dean aside. I said, you know, this Advent thing that you keep talking about, I thought it was just a calendar. I had no idea. Like, I knew it was kind of churchy, but I didn't realize the significance of it. And there was no training, so I had to do a lot of Googling. So I'd love to see more resources for church administrators come to fruition, and this is just the start of that. So I'm kind of opening that up. There's a lot of things that you guys can talk about. The years, ABC, the seasons of the church, liturgical resources that are out there. I'll kick it off, or I'll turn it over to you guys to we're just going to have an open, casual discussion about this and let the conversation go where it goes.
Well, I'm curious about what questions are out there, because I'm an Episcopal priest. I serve in a Lutheran congregation, so I had to do some of this myself, in translating my Episcopal training to Lutheran world, which are really, really similar. I would say they're like the difference between Spanish and Italian. Like, you can get by in either of them, but they're pretty similar. But I asked my admin, and she's also an admin at a Presbyterian church. So I wonder how many of you are in two worlds at the same time, and if that causes some confusion or questions or things like that. And so I asked her what her questions were, and she goes, well, I've served in 4 different denominations at this point, so I've kind of figured it out by now, so she couldn't really point me. So I really am curious what your questions are. But some of the one of the things that first came up is just like the weird language in the Episcopal Church. And there's some weird language in the Lutheran Church too, and I'm sure in every tradition, but why do we call prayers collects in the Episcopal Church? So why don't we just call it a prayer, And it's, for me, it's helpful to remember that that it literally means to collect thoughts, to sort of summarize the day. And so there are a few places where we have a collect rather than a prayer. So there's what in a lot of denominations would be called the prayer of the day, and the Episcopal Church is called the collect of the day, because that comes earlier in the liturgy. And then we have the prayers of the people, which are more open, you can pray about whatever. We invite people to pray for the church, the world, and all who are in need, for example. And so we open it up to everything. And then at the end of that, there's what we call the collect, there's another collect, because we sort of summarize the thoughts. So there's lots of different weird language, but I would be curious what questions you have. And I'd be curious what the other panelists have to say too.
Well, I don't have any questions, but my name is Dio Dillard. I live in the Diocese of Washington, D.C. I started May 1st at the Falls Church Episcopal, which is the remnant of the split, 2006. And before that, I was the administrator at a Baptist church for 10 years. And liturgically, it's a lot like an Episcopal church. They observe Advent, they observe Lent. But there it was, you've got the Alliance of Baptists, the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, the National Baptist, the Progressive National Baptist, the Southern Baptist. So that was a big learning curve for me to try and figure out who all these groups were. We were aligned with both. The DC Baptist Convention was aligned with the Southern Baptists until Calvary Baptist here in DC called 2 female lesbian priests as co-pastors. And so the Southern Baptists kicked us out. We were like, fine, it means we don't have to send you any more money. So now working at an Episcopal church, it's like, fine, it's easy. I don't do the bulletin. I have someone else who does that, but I'm involved in everything else: stewardship, outreach, B&G, finance, vestry, you name it. And so it's just a lot to wrap your arms around, and doing it during a time when nobody's really there and we're not having church in the building, services in the building. And we have an interim rector. And so there's a search committee calling a new rector, and the associate rector who'd been there for 5 years just left. So now we'll have an interim associate rector. So there's just lots of moving parts right now. Hopefully, once we can kind of get back to worshiping in the building and people are around, it'll be a smoother ride. But right now it's kind of crazy. So that's where I am.
Well, is it Denise? Dionise?
Dionise or Dio, just Dio.
Okay. One thing I've been wondering about is, are there particular things that have come up since churches have gone online, with bulletins and trying to communicate things? Because I know in our context, like, I see the bulletin as primarily a communication device to help people participate. It's not about just including all the info. It should be like presented in a way that like it invites people to participate. And that's what liturgy itself is, versus just like a worship service where you go and you sit and you kind of watch. Like, liturgy is about a dialogue between those who are leading, ordained people and lay leaders and the whole congregation. And so like in our context, I know like we had to like bump up like the size of our font really big in our bulletin. We had to sort of change directions or rubrics, like, and kind of play around with that to get people to like, do we still want people to stand for the gospel? How does that work at home? So have you noticed any like changes, questions from going online? No.
So I can share a little bit.
Just add something to that, because before we get started in the nuts and bolts, perhaps we ought to talk a little bit about what liturgy is. And so in my understanding, liturgy is always an arch. It starts at the beginning, it goes as an arch over to sending. Liturgy doesn't begin with the words, please rise, or, Almighty God, to you all hearts are open, and so on. Liturgy begins on Saturday afternoon when the family decides we are going to go to church tomorrow morning. And so even to begin with, in terms of liturgy, we ought to have some acknowledgement that the gathering doesn't just start right when the words say, the Lord be with you, but the gathering had started earlier. That's the first. And then I wanted to say is, for me, it's always important to figure out who in the liturgy talks to whom. Is it God who speaks to the people through scripture? Is it the people who talk to God through prayers? Is it the ordained clergy that speaks to a congregation? What is the speech pattern that we are engaging? For example, and I learned at some point that not everybody knew that, the psalm is always in response to the Old Testament reading. And because the Old Testament reading can either be complementary to the gospel, or can be semi-continuous to the gospel, or can be narrative, all of a sudden you end up with 3 different psalms, and you need to figure out in which lectionary system, if you want, you are. I think before we are talking about font size, we ought to figure out what the overall arching liturgy concept is. At least I think if I were an administrator, that would be more my question, but I might be wrong. And so please tell me.
Stephanie, if I can pick up on that point, I really appreciate you setting that larger context for what the liturgy really even is. I like to say, that we often hear, perhaps y'all have heard, that the liturgy is the work of the people. That's not actually the best translation of the word liturgy. It's the work for the people. I won't belabor what exactly that word meant in its ancient Greco-Roman context, but just to say it's really an act of public service. And that's what you as administrators are doing. You're helping to create the context for people to know their part in that back and forth speaking role between us as a congregation and us and God in corporate worship. And indeed to hear what the Spirit has to say to the church in this day and time. So as you're changing font sizes and messing with bulletins and trying to figure out the difference between track 1 and 2 and year A and C and all of that stuff, I want to encourage you and really thank you for your ministry of creating that context so the people can show up, and whether it's on the screen or in a bulletin, have that piece in their hands to know where their part is in the corporate worship. What a vital role that is. And one more thing that I would add quickly here, just to further that point, is I often tell people that the word hocus pocus, do you know where that comes from?
Oh, yeah.
It actually comes from the hoc es corpus in the Latin Mass. In pre-Reformation context, where the priest would hold up the host and speak in Latin, a language that at that time the common person didn't speak, it became sort of this magic mumbo jumbo for folks. And the church has moved beyond that sort of the priest is offering all the worship on behalf of the people, and has moved into what in the Vatican II parlance is the full active and conscious participation of the people. So again, as you're helping to prepare bulletins or to prepare the context for us to enter into corporate worship together, that's really what you're doing. Is you're enabling people to enter into that full active and conscious participation of the worship, and not just a bunch of hocus pocus that some person in a collar is doing up on a stage.
Yeah.
Can you start to describe, we're just going to assume that we know nothing about the structure of a liturgy. And so where do the prayers come from? What is this whole year A, B, C thing? Can you talk to that?
I can speak from the context. Of course, we have the Book of Common Prayer that has its antecedents in what was called the Sarum Missal. There was a cathedral in Salisbury, England, and in the medieval era, many cathedrals would sort of set their own worship. And so they vary from city to city. But that book of worship from the Salisbury Cathedral in England is sort of the grandparent of our Book of Common Prayer, which was developed in 1979, in many ways in a response to Vatican II, which was a council of the entire Roman Catholic Church, and a response to a liturgical movement. And I won't belabor the details on that, but it incorporated new elements from a number of different traditions, and including the Lutherans and Presbyterians and Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics and so on and so forth. The thing to look for in our context is rubrics. Those are all the italics. That's kind of how you determine how to choose your own adventure as you're making the bulletin. Those will dictate what's possible and where you go to look for different aspects of our liturgy. And that word rubric just comes from the Latin term meaning read, because in the old missals and the old prayer books, they would dictate, here's where you go, turn to this page, or this is what prayer you insert here. And all of those instructions were in red. Those in the Episcopal Church have the sort of force of canon law. That's when I make a vow as a priest to the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Episcopal Church. I'm saying I'm going to follow the rubrics. And those help me as a priest and you as an administrator, us as a whole church, determine where to go to look for different things. Then the other place to look would be just general convention that helps us determine what, in the Episcopal Church, what scriptures we can use in the public proclamation of Scripture, what lectionaries we're on, following the Revised Common Lectionary, the lectionary in the Book of Common Prayer, so on and so forth. Greg and Stephanie?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to the development of the lectionary in the 3-year cycle of A, B, and C. So right now we are in year A, which means the Gospel of Matthew is predominantly read. Year B is Mark, year C is Luke. John gets thrown in ever so often for festivals, special services, this day or the other. And the gospel reading, and I believe that also comes out of Vatican II, it's my understanding, that 3-year cycle. And so that gospel is the core, if you want. And then, as I mentioned before, you have an Old Testament reading. Hebrew scriptures, whatever your preferred term is for that. And that, again, is either complementary to the gospel reading. So if there's a healing story, chances in the gospel, chances are it's also a healing story from the Old Testament. If there is a rejoice story in the gospel, you have a rejoice text from Isaiah or something like this. Or you go semi-continual, because people were starting to get a little uneasy about the fact that there were so many texts that were never read, and that there was no red thread that was moving through the readings, so that, because you sort of have the gospel as the core, you then pick for the complementary whatever just comes to your mind, or came to the mind of the people who developed this. And so they wanted to have a little bit more of a red thread throughout the readings. And then only, I want to say, in the last 15 or 20 years, that narrative lectionary came up, with which I have blissfully no experience at all. I have never used it. So I am not the right person to talk about that. But I do know that what it tried to do is to address the woeful biblical illiteracy we have. Honestly, not just among laypersons, also among some clergy, and to force us to look at the entire story and know the key stories of the faith. Reagan, sorry for not getting a word in.
I don't want to say too much, although I do, because I see that there's already some questions. Two things did come to mind. One is the question of authority that Joseph brought up with canon law in the Episcopal Church and in rubrics. And I think it's important to know the sort of chain of authority in whatever tradition you're serving in, For Baptists, it's very different. You're the pastor is, and the whole staff is going to be, they're going to answer to the deacon board. I grew up Southern Baptist, and somebody brought up alliance and cooperative, and I'm very familiar with all that. I don't know the Presbyterian system as much, but I know that there's something very similar. And in the Episcopal and Lutheran context, we have bishops. Now they function differently in the Episcopal Church and in the ELCA, but we still are in relationship there. And I think that the important thing is just to know the specifics of that and to know why. It's not just a a question of me having a boss. It's a question of the liturgy belongs to the whole church, you know, which kind of, so people will often ask me in my context, you know, where does stuff come from? Can we just make up stuff on our own? And even though I serve in a congregation that's probably more, you know, we do some new and innovative things, we are still in relationship with our bishops in terms of what we are doing. We are accountable to them. And so we, like, you know, one of the conversations that's out there now is virtual Eucharist, and, you know, how do you do all these kinds of things? And so that means I can't just decide what I'm going to do. I'm in conversation with the wider church through our bishop, because, you know, a lot of us have pointed to the fact that liturgy is a participatory experience between clergy, leaders, congregation, and God. And so that goes beyond just the congregation, it goes to the whole church. And so that's why we have rubrics and why we have. And I think it also, the other thing that people have asked me is, why do clergy in the Episcopal Church and the Lutheran Church often not just pray extemporaneously in the liturgy, you know? Or why do we have set prayers? Why do we have collects and things like that? And the reason is because, I mean, one of the reasons is because the liturgy belongs to the whole church. We're praying not just the whole church today, but the whole church going back to the very beginnings. And so, like, if you read the history of, say, like the Book of Common Prayer, you'll notice that, like, as Joseph pointed out, that most of our collects, most of our prayers are in some or revised, tweaked versions of ancient prayers. And so that's one of the most exciting things to me about liturgy in general, is that we are leaning into the wisdom of our ancestors and acknowledging that, like, we don't have all the answers ourselves. You know, just because we've got iPhones and Starbucks and Netflix and all of that, like, we have some wisdom, but we don't have all of it. And so we really need that wisdom of our ancestors. So anyhow, I noticed that Liz was raising her hand, or yeah.
All right, thanks. I may be on a different thread. I was wanting to respond, Reagan, to your earlier question, or maybe Joseph, your earlier question about sort of like, what are people doing? So that may not be the time. So I'm happy to talk when it's time.
Fine with me.
I would like to just piggyback a tiny bit on Regan, what he just said, in terms of the different authority structure between the ELCA and the Episcopalians, because I just learned this like in a crash course. So in the Lutheran Church, you have one ordination, and that is to the pastorate. And our bishop is set apart for the pastorate to the diocese, or respectively to the synod, which the ELCA calls that. In the ordination, you have the ordination to the diaconate, to the priesthood, and the consecration to the episcopacy. That means that in the ELCA, when we started the shutdown, no Lutheran bishop told his or her clergy to not celebrate communion or Eucharist. That would be absolutely and utterly impossible, because the bishop to the synod is on the same level, if you want, as every other pastor in a congregation. And so you had in the ELCA a whole lot of different ways of how communion was being practiced, you know, with people either coming, you know, and picking up bread and wine, or with people having it delivered, or with people, you know, bringing their own crackers and wine, or whatever, you know. And in the Episcopal Church, it was very clear when the rules for Eucharist were relaxed that bread and wine needed to be in the same physical space as the person consecrating it. which got me into this interesting situation that my last Sunday at Holy Comforter was the 18th and I celebrated there according to all the rules and regulations that were set out. And the following Sunday, I had been asked to fill in for a colleague of mine, and it was Reformation Sunday in the ELCA. And I had to say, after 20 weeks at Holy Comforter, in the announcements, please remember we are celebrating communion today, so please find a piece of bread or some crackers and find some wine, because we will be having this meal together, at the end of the service. And I was sort of, I wanted to become bilingual between the Lutherans and the Episcopalians, but it felt very split personality to me right at that moment, that the things that I wasn't able to do or shouldn't be doing the week before, all of a sudden were what I was encouraging people to do the following Sunday. So here are some of our challenges that we are currently having in our life together as, in full communion relationships.
Liz, can we go back to your question?
Yeah, thanks, Joseph.
Sure. So I just wanted to share a little bit about what we are doing from a liturgical perspective here in case it's useful to anyone else. So thanks. I appreciate being reminded that the liturgy starts like Wednesday. It doesn't start Sunday. But probably it really starts that on Saturday night at about dinner time. I send out the bulletin in a call to worship email. And since COVID's happened, we started doing a lot more direct communication email. So we do at least twice a week, like a newsletter. Actually, sometimes we do 3, like a newsletter, a call to worship for midweek services, and then a call to worship for Sunday. We also try to use Flocknote, which is a group texting service, and we're using that sporadically, but we're trying to get better at that. Again, just to sort of have that continuity. And then the liturgy probably starts when people start jumping on. So we do Zoom, we do live church over Zoom, and we have a group of about 35 people. So that actually works really well for us. So that's a nice thing, because then really the liturgy continues when we're all sort of showing up on Zoom and everyone's saying good morning and hello and how are you and look at your dog and all of that. So it's really lovely. We get readers for the prayers of the people and the 3 readings that morning. We just ask who wants to, and then usually we get 2 people to read the psalm back and forth. In terms of font sizes and stuff, we moved from like having a dual page bulletin to having just a single page bulletin. And I space everything out so that when I'm scrolling, you only see the part that we're talking about. So it ends up being a really long bulletin. It's like 15 pages, but most people don't print it anyways. So that's worked out really well for us. And people do stay after a little bit and celebrate. And then now we're doing a bi-weekly communion. So we consecrate here in the church one week, and we're doing Zoom from the church. We've got like a step ladder in the choir, like it's pretty fun. And then then we come back and the 3 of us are like packaging communion and writing people's names on it. And we've got little communion kits that we are getting like prepackaged. And so those all go up on the altar, and then those get consecrated. And so therefore the liturgy continues, and then people come to the church and pick it up. And then the following week we go ahead and we take it together. So we sort of split the service between the 2 weeks. And I think the only other thing I would say is, so that's like my professional life. I also do a little bit of, I run a night prayers service just as a lay leader out of St. John's. And I will say that I do appreciate what Reagan was saying about leaning on the ancestors, because it's fun to experiment with liturgy, but there's actually, the formula does hold true. And I feel like if I get too far afield from it, something gets lost. So coming back at the same time, having doing this and having gone to the wilderness for most of my adult Christian experience, I feel very comfortable with the canticle can be whatever you want it to be. The music can be whatever you want it to be, you know, like how does it serve, you know, is it good to have meditative music here because we need to really take in what we just experienced? I feel like there's a lot of elements that can be dropped into the rubric and still have the rubric hold true. And I think that's really fun. That's one of my fun things I do. So anyways, thanks. And I'm sorry, I have to run, but I'll be listening. Thank you.
Oh.
I just want to say in response to that it's such a wonderful example of the kind of work that y'all do behind the scenes to make our corporate worship possible. You know, I always think about the collect and compline, that the praise for those who work while others sleep. And that's what administrators do a lot. Y'all are working behind the scenes. For a lot of us, we just show up on Sunday and we just say the words on the page or on the screen or in the book, what have you. But it's the administrators who are putting all that stuff together behind the scenes to really facilitate that worship. And what a wonderful example, whether it's the nudge to be reminded about the midweek service or the service coming up on Sunday, that all that you do to prepare us for that corporate worship. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
If I can ask some leading questions as to how does the daily office fold into this? Are the readings on Sundays just picked willy-nilly, or do they follow? What is this pattern that we keep on referencing? And how does that ABC kind of work?
A little bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
So in the sort of historic church, I would say, you know, all the churches, almost any church, well, Episcopal, Lutheran, maybe the Methodists at times, Catholic, Orthodox, churches that have bishops generally. We have two primary, I take that back. I would say all churches have, you know, your corporate Sunday worship, which usually revolves around communion. Even if you're only doing it 4 times a year, that's the setting where you would have communion. And then you have your prayer meetings, you know, which we in the Episcopal Church and the Lutheran Church call a daily office, which is morning prayer. The main ones are morning prayer and evening prayer, which in the Lutheran Church, a lot of times morning prayer is called matins. Sometimes evening prayer is called vespers. That's also true in other traditions. But for me, this might be controversial among some clergy, but I believe that the daily office really belongs to lay people. You know, there is a place for clergy, but it is in the Episcopal Church, the daily office the rubrics are very different from Holy Eucharist on Sunday. Who can read things, who can say what, who can lead. Of course, a clergy can lead the daily office and often do, but I see the daily office really as the liturgy to give away as much as possible, you know, and I'm a big fan of giving away parts even in Holy Eucharist, but there are more limitations there, and we could talk about why that is, but the daily office really comes out of monastic tradition, out of communities gathering during the week, often in between celebrations of the Eucharist, to pray about like their common lives. And this is one of the things that I have been most excited about during the pandemic, is the way that our community and lots of communities have become communities that pray together for the world, for each other, in a way that I think in a lot of places, I mean, I'll just speak for my context, we were not doing and did not really even know how to do at the beginning of the pandemic. But now, you know, we do morning prayer every morning. We do compline once a week, and lay people lead it. I show up, but I literally, maybe I chant the Lord's Prayer or something like that if they ask me. But this is their liturgy to do. And so they can read all of it. They can lead all of it. Any others? Joseph, Stephanie, do you have thoughts on the daily office and how it fits in?
Just to agree with you, historically, that the daily office emerges in the Anglican tradition as a way of taking a sevenfold prayer life that monks would do in a monastery and trying to condense those sevenfold offices that began before sunrise and continued after sundown And so the average person couldn't do that. The average person doesn't live in a monastery, but it was a way of trying to condense that down to 2 services that the average person could do, and to encourage the whole church to enter into this form of worship together in morning and evening prayer. That's where Matins and Vespers comes from, is the monastic office, the Latin terms for the monastic office. But again, that desire to try to incorporate all people into that full active and conscious participation. Regarding the lectionary, we have 2 different lectionaries in the Episcopal Church. One is the Eucharistic lectionary. That's what's on the ABC cycle if you're following the revised Common Lectionary. Not to get too into the weeds again, but that RCL was an ecumenical response to Vatican II that reformed its own lectionary, the Catholic Church reforming its own way of reading the scriptures in public for that communion service on Sundays. And a number of different Protestant traditions got together and said, how do we look at this as our own lectionary traditions and get literally on the same page, so that whatever our different traditions, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist, Episcopal, that we're all reading the same texts on Sundays. And that means that I can then have a conversation with my Presbyterian pastor friend about the readings for Sunday, and you can, your Lutheran neighbor, and instead of us all being on different lectionary texts. And then in the daily office, we have a different lectionary. It's the daily office lectionary in the Episcopal Church. That's on a 2-year cycle. And it's just a wonderful way. You've heard of read the Bible in the year plans. Well, we have that built into the Book of Common Prayer in the morning and evening prayer. It's a way of reading through the entirety of Scripture over the course of 2 years. And that means, yes, that you have to read through Leviticus and Numbers and Second Chronicles and all that stuff. But often, surprisingly, there's a little nugget for the Holy Spirit and that stuff for you too.
Mm-hmm.
If I just go back to the daily office, if you go to the Good Friday story in the Gospels, there the outline is sort of set. 6 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock in the morning, at noon, at 3 o'clock. And then you have the evening services are, of course, not in that sense outlined, but you can actually make a case for this going back all the way to the very first Good Friday, in how the gospel was written at that point, always in those 3-hour watch, which coincided with the Roman soldiers' watch schedule, first watch, second watch, third watch, and so on. And what happened with Jesus at these moments. And so that's where the prayer life originated for the monastic tradition. And most laypersons throughout the Reformation did find a way to put it into their own life.
Donna asked a really good question in chat. I just want to flag that up. Donna Karp asked, that they basically post their bulletin on the website, but is concerned that older members of the congregation, people who may be less technologically adept, are not able to access it or can't do split screen, and is asking for some suggestions. And other people are talking about sending it out on Constant Contact, about using ways of Google Slides and other forms of having the worship on the screen. To Regan's earlier point, I think this is a great example of not just saying what, but why. And Donna, really what you're going for here is that full active and conscious participation of everybody so that they have the tools that they need to participate in the service. That's the why. And then we have the technologies to try to help us accomplish that. And a number of good suggestions about different ways you can invite everybody into worship, especially in these challenging times when we're all trying to adapt on the fly.
Thank you. One thing I did want to mention about the daily office is, again, why we do it when we do it, and why we don't have just prayer meeting at 3 p.m. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but why, morning prayer is, of course, at 7 in the morning or 8 in the morning or something like that. it does go back to the monastic tradition and to all of the things that people have said, but I think it's also important to say that in the daily office, the sacramental aspect of that, even though there's not a consecration of a Eucharist or a baptism or some, the sacramental nature of it is prayer and nature, I would say, because we are honoring those specific times of day, and that comes from Jewish tradition, that there were times of day in the morning and at noon and at night where folks would lift up their hands to God and give thanks for what was coming and what had been, and prayers for, a peaceful night, that they would survive the night, and all of this. So there's a way in which, we say in Vespers, let my prayer rise up as incense before you. So like the prayer is the sacrament, but also the time of day is the sacrament. Sometimes the reason I bring that up is sometimes people will kind of see the daily office as a lesser part of our tradition. And like the thing that matters is Sunday Holy Eucharist, because it's the sacrament, and I'm a Eucharistic guy. It's like at the center of my life. And there's a way in which I think we've done a disservice to the daily office. And there's a way in which this moment in history is inviting us back into a deeper relationship with the daily office.
I once took my parents to a worship service at an Episcopal church in the Diocese of Colorado. And it was in a mountain town, and we got our bulletin when we walked in. People were friendly. And in the bulletin were like 8 different flyers stuffed in there. And I think they had tried to save money by having just a shell and kind of a pre-printed in there. And so what happened was during the entire time of worship, people would like flip to a different insert to read the prayers. And then they'd go back, and in the bulletin it would say WLP 323, and then there was also a hymn board. It said see hymn board. And after the worship service, I asked my parents what they thought, and they said, we spent the entire time just trying to figure out what the hell was going on, that we actually didn't go to a worship service. We just tried to figure out what was going on. And they said, we said a lot of words, but it wasn't prayers. So is there a barrier in our liturgical services to worship for people who are not of a tradition where maybe they grew up with godly play to kind of describe the seasons, and they never get it because we don't have an Episcopal 101 class necessarily that people attend? Or do you? How do we remove these barriers so we allow people to worship better?
I'm super biased. I am very biased that we should be doing all we can to make it as participatory and easy for people to enter into worship. And if that means giving up our hymnals and printing everything in a single booklet or having it projected on screens, there are different options for different contexts. But I think, sticking to the old thing because that's what people are comfortable with who are already there. I mean, that's just sin 101. If we want to talk about 101 classes, that is just not inviting people into corporate relationship with God. So I would say some of what has worked for us are including everything in a booklet, everything that they need. Mm-hmm. But I would say not include, I think it's important also not to include everything, because if you put everything in the booklet, then people's faces are in the booklet the whole time. And maybe you're not creating a space for people to settle in and worship. And so, when this, of course, has changed during the pandemic because we're at home and we're not in the same room where we can hear as easily. But when we are together, I think, having some readings that aren't in the booklet that you just listen to, now that, again, there are accessibility issues I want to be sensitive to as well. So it might be different in different places. But the other thing is, I talked to somebody about, I think this is true for evangelical folks, but I also asked, the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, we're the 2 widest denominations in America. The ELCA is number 1. I think Episcopal Church is number 2. So we're not doing much better than the All Lutherans. I asked, what are some of the like hidden things, hidden to maybe white people in our liturgy that make it white, that make it inaccessible to a lot of people of color? And
the music. In DC, you get a skewed view because the Diocese of Washington is very diverse. We have a lot of historically Black congregations. We have a lot of Latino congregations. But to your point about making it accessible, my mom, who was raised Baptist, came to church with me years ago. And when we were done, she said, "This is too much." I said, "She got a book, you got a hymnal, you got a thing." She said, "Nobody who doesn't know what this is about is going to be able to keep up." And I talked to the rector at the time and I said, this is a barrier to people who are not familiar with the church. And so now everything's in there, the music, the prayers, the readings, it's there. We do a large print version. And so people are not fumbling between. The only time we use it different is if we sing something out of Lift Every Voice. But other than that, it's all in the bulletin. But I think for a lot of folks, it's music. Like I've had my friends come to church with me sometime and they're like, "Lovely service, but the music is just so," to them, it's like if you go to even St. Augustine Catholic Church here, which is the oldest Black Catholic church in the city, the music is it'll make you cry. It's so beautiful and moving. And as much as I love the hymnody of our church, it's not something to me that's going to make you leave. You're not going to leave the church humming Tony Botel. It's just not, that's not going to happen. So I think for some people it's music, but other people have said the prayers are lovely, and no, it's not extemporaneous. And I think a lot of people who have grown up in a tradition of Baptist churches say where prayers are extemporaneous and the minister might pray for 10 minutes extemporaneously. There are set prayers. And I always tell people, when I worked at the Baptist church, that even there, the service was an hour. You were in and out. And people complained if it went more than about 10 minutes past 12 o'clock. And this was a predominantly white congregation, but I think people are used to what they're used to. I was raised Roman Catholic. I was not, grew up in the church when the mass was in Latin. And yes, the red part was the Latin part was on this side and the English part was on this side, so you could follow along. But I love the liturgy of the church. But I think for some people, music is just too staid. It's a bunch of dead English composers, and who cares?
Yeah, I think that's really important. But what my friend, who's an ELCA pastor, he's Lenny Duncan, you might have heard of him. He wrote this book, Dear Church. But I had a conversation with him about this, and he said the one thing that he's noticed that is most important is having some space for spontaneity. Some space for something extemporaneous, whether it's prayers or some kind of response, so that when you do the prayers of the people, you actually make space for people to pray, to really pray, not just to mumble or, just sit there in silence, but to actually have the experience of someone has something well up in them that they can actually express. And he talked to me about different ways that they did that in terms of, having a time before the liturgy for people to just pray over each other. And then they went into the more formal liturgy. So we've been experimenting with that, having more places for people to speak back in the space. And it really has worked for us.
I think your question is so important, and it actually resonates with Donna's question. It's really the same question: is what are our techniques of trying to incorporate as many people as possible to the full extent possible. I just want to flag up a little historical nerd note that the book itself is a technology, that the bound book, and that really in many respects sparked the revolution that is the Reformation and the inclusion of laity in the full active conscious participation of worship. And what the church has sometimes failed to do is to really adapt. We are really a fundamentally conservative, traditional church. We hold on to those traditions, and traditions are wonderful things. They are the wisdom of our grandmothers and our great grandmothers passed down to us. But how do we continue in every age, every epoch, to continue to adapt to what the moment is requiring of us? And so, Donna, your question about a PDF bulletin on a website, if that's not accessible for your congregation, then what are the different tools and techniques that you can use to get the liturgy into the people's hands, so that they're not just watching it on a screen? That's one of the most dangerous things I think about this coronavirus time, is that if we have turned parishioners into just passive consumers of worship that is happening on a screen somewhere far away, we have really done a disservice to our folks. So how do we do everything that we can to involve people in the worship? And then maybe get to some of these more fundamental questions that Regan and others are raising about, what is it in our traditions that might be blind spots to that participation, whether it's the musical tradition. I had a great moment where one time I was texting a friend and misspelled bird, and it autocorrected to BYRD, the great composer. So that's how deep I swim in English music tradition. But that is potentially a blind spot for us as Episcopalians, and creates barriers to participation from other people that we don't even see.
Can you describe why the NSRV is used versus other versions of the Bible?
Yes, so the NRSV is one of actually many tradition of translations that the Episcopal Church has approved for public use in worship. It's probably the most common. It stands for the New Revised Standard Version, and before it there was a Revised Standard Version, which is why there's now a New Revised Standard Version. Bear in mind that the Bible was not written in English.
What?
Yeah, it was written in Hebrew, of course, through the Hebrew scriptures, and then the New Testament texts were written in Greek. So anything that, if we're not reading it in Hebrew and Greek, we're reading a translation. And that is the work often of a committee of biblical scholars that try to give the most faithful rendition of those texts to the people in their own language. And there are a number of different things that separate the NIV. The NIV was written, for instance, I think primarily by Baptist scholars who were trying to get a text in very simple English because of a missional imperative. They wanted to have a Bible that could be used for their missionizing in the world. And if the language of the scripture wasn't understandable to people because the English was too complicated, well, we need to have a more simple version of the text. And other translations like the Contemporary English Version are translations that are trying to take relatively complex uses of the English language and simplify it down to a 8th grade reading level or a 6th grade reading level, so that they can be more inclusive. So NRSV is what most churches use, but there are a number of different translations, including the King James Version, which is the first translation of the Latin Bible, the Vulgate, into English so that people could use it and they could understand it in their own language.
Is that required?
One of the reasons that we read the NRSV, although we don't exclusively, as Joseph pointed out, sometimes in my context we'll read the Message or Contemporary English, even King James. I love the King James with caveats.
Anyway,
But the NRSV, it's not like a fully super like gender neutral Bible, but it is more so. There's places where in older translations, they would have said man to mean humankind, to mean all of us. They now have translated that to say humankind, and things of that nature. So that's one of the reasons, you know, that we read NRSV is because I mean, both the Episcopal Church, Lutheran Church, and probably a lot of other mainline traditions. I mean, we value the dignity of every human being. We vow to that in our baptism. So we vow to respect the dignity of every human being in our baptism. So that is one reason. The message is also very clear in a way, but some people have strong feelings about that because it's technically a paraphrase. Like maybe you remember what was called the Living Bible or the New Living Bible. I grew up with that, which is another paraphrase, an older paraphrase. The message is a kind of a paraphrase for today's world, and it can be sometimes very spot on, and other times I find it kind of hokey. It's like it's sort of like it's so common that like I can't even hear it, you know. Like I don't know what it is. I think it was Liz who said, you know, there's something about using language that lets us feel that connection with our ancestors. You know, we've heard, you know, the NRSV still tries to kind of maintain some of the poetic structure of the King James translation. So it's still familiar enough that even though it's not the same as the King James, you know what you're hearing. You can kind of connect with it. The message is totally different, but I'm not saying don't use it. It's just that's the reason why some of us are like, you know, because scholarly, it may kind of take some leaps that maybe aren't quite. It's not what the text says. It's what the guy who translated it thought it meant, you know, which maybe it did, but you know, maybe it meant something else. And so it kind of, there's much more of a bias there.
In just our last 2 minutes that we have left, are you using Right Planning? What are you using as the tools to put together like a Sunday bulletin? Or do you have a folder that you dust off and pull out from year A 3 years ago?
We have a template, and I can't remember. It's from another church that we just asked. We loved the look of it, so we just asked for that. And then I just go through and, you know, use the lectionary and stuff like that. And the priest and I work in that together.
So you have 156 files that you just kind of cycle through in order to kind of.
It's a lot. Yeah. It's probably not the most effective way to do it, but.
I'm curious why there isn't a provided liturgy like Word document or InDesign document that churches can just piggyback off of, like switch out the readings if they want, or, you know, why isn't that just a given? Why isn't that accessible?
Like I've thought this for years. Churches reinvent the wheel all the time. It'd be nice if we know what the lectionary texts are going to be. We know most churches are on Right too. It'd be great if everybody got one email with a editable Word doc that we could all just copy and paste, and you don't have to go through every single week and go to lectionarypage.net to look up the text. But that does not exist at present. Maybe Mike Orr could help us with that.
I would just call and tell you.
We'll just say one more thing about the bulletin, and you asked about instructed Eucharist. You know, we try to do at Christ Church this in the Eucharist, that we time to time just say, hey, we're going to do the collect for purity. And this is a chance just to ask for the Holy Spirit to just cleanse us from any of the junk that we brought into this place as we enter into the worship and the holiness of God. We're going to do the collect for the day today. And we try to pause in the liturgy just to do a little bit of teaching here and there, although we also do the whole instructed Eucharist where we pause and say, this is where this is coming from. I would also encourage you to think about in your bulletins, before just plopping this down, that you have a little explanation about what this is. Talk to your clergy or talk to other folks to say, this is a collect for purity, this is where it comes from. This is the Nicene Creed, and the church has been confessing this since 325, and this is where this comes from. And going back to Reagan's point again about the what and the why, ask the questions, what is this thing? And then be able to articulate, why do we do what we do? That's one of the most important things I think we can do.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of electronic help, the ELCA has a resource that is called Sundays and Seasons.
Yeah,
And that is quite amazing. And you can actually plan worship services there. They have recommendations. They tell you what the different texts are. You have links to it and so on. I have found that very helpful when I was in ELCA congregations as a general help. They also write the prayers of the people every Sunday.
Thank you, everybody, for being a part of this today. I know some people have to jump off for some other calls, but this was really helpful, and I know it's going to lead to further conversations. And Joseph creating the bulletin for us every week in advance.
You didn't know you were going to leave with more work, huh?
Thanks, Mike.
Bye.
Mike. Thanks, Stephanie and Joseph. Yeah.